Welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about all the books I read in 2023. I'm going to be talking about each one of the books I read and then saying a little review about each one and like how I would rate it. I write down all the books that I read in a year. I managed to fit them all in. I also have on my phone this app called Goodreads. So every single one of the books I've read this year I've put onto Goodreads, and some of them I wrote a little review about, but I rated all of them. So that's why I'm reading off my phone. Let's just start at the beginning of the year. My first book, Misery Bay by Steve Hamilton. So this book I rated 5 stars. Throughout the year, I really got more strict with my ratings. So like Misery Bay, I rated it 5 stars when I read it, but I wouldn't rate it 5 stars now, probably. Just keep that in mind as I go on. So pretty much it's about this guy who's a police officer who lives up in Michigan, and he has to investigate for several murders. They don't know if it's murders or suicides because it's set up as suicides, but it's a very thrilling mystery that takes you along through his adventures in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's a very cold book. It was the kind of book that made you want to snuggle up in your bed to read it. The next book I read was The Marsh King's Daughter. So that was a book I got from the library. I rated this 4 stars. So it was another book set in Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, and it was about this woman who was abducted as a child by this man who was of the Indian tribe up there. Well, the story has to do with going back and her remembering everything that happened and how both her and her mother lived out in the woods with this man, and it's kind of like a trauma tale, honestly. Her feelings of either do I want to love him or do I hate him because of what he did to me. Next book I read was another Steve Hamilton book that I don't have, and it was called To Die a Stranger. I rated this book 3 stars. So it was a major step down from the first Steve Hamilton book I read. This one was about this guy who had to deal with this drug cartel. His best friend somehow gets roped into this cartel. So pretty much he's trying to track down his best friend and save him from the evil cartel who's trying to kill him because now he knows too much. So it just wasn't my favorite. I felt like it was kind of predictable. The next book I read was Be Not Far From Me by Mindy McGinnis. So I pretty much devoured this book. It was keeping with the theme that I kind of have going of murder mystery. This one I rated 4 stars. It's about this girl who goes on a camping trip with her friends up in the Appalachian Mountains. She gets mad, storms off, and falls down a hill, gets separated from the group, and she's lost on the Appalachian Trail. So it's pretty much her adventure in the wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. It takes you through all her struggles, and you don't know if she's gonna die. You don't know if she's ever gonna find civilization again. I would definitely suggest this book. It's easy, fast read, but it's really, really intense. Alright, next book I read was Guy in Real Life by Steve Bresnoff. This one was horrible. I rated it 2 stars. Really didn't want to finish it. I forced myself to finish it. It was too into video games. The plot was interesting though. The only reason I was able to finish it. Pretty much it bounces back chapter to chapter. One chapter is in real life and another chapter is of in the video game. I just am not into video games, and it was not really that interesting for me. Next book I read called Body in the Woods by April Henry, going along with my Murder in the Woods theme. This book was about this girl. So she goes out with her friend and tries to find this missing person, and it turns into a lot more than just a missing person that they find. They find a dead body and they have to find the murderer. But she makes friends along the way, and it's an alternating storyline between each person's perspective. I rated it 3 stars. Wouldn't read it again, but it was interesting while I was reading it. Next book I read was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I had already watched the show before I read the book, but I rated it 5 stars. So the book is set up in a way that it's kind of like a script. You could have the book open while you're watching the show and follow along with exactly what they're saying. If I had read that before I watched the show, I think I would have liked the show even more. The next book I read was The River by Peter Heller. I rated this one 4 out of 5 stars. It's a nice adventure book that's plot was interesting enough to make you want to read it, but not a book that I just couldn't put down. It's a good summer or fall read. It had me shocked at the end, and I have to say, I put the book down feeling very sad. It was a good book overall, but I just don't like sad endings. This book is about these two boys. It's their summer break, and they are taking this canoe trip down this river. They have to make it to the lodge by a certain date, otherwise it's going to start getting cold. The plot goes, there's a fire behind them, and so they have to speed up their trip because they have to get away from the fire, and they run into some dangerous people along the way. It has a very, very sad ending. I was crying in this book because it was really sad and I was shocked. 4 out of 5 stars for that, only because it had a sad ending. I liked that book so much that I read the next book by this author, which is The Guide. I rated it 5 out of 5 stars. The review that I wrote for this was quite lengthy. It was a really good book. I wrote, this was the most intense book I think I've ever read. First, it was slow and relaxing at the beginning, which is what I was expecting, but it got more and more intense as it went on, and the plot built, and everything started to come together. By the end, I was reading frantically fast with anxiety to see what would happen. It was a little bit disturbing because of some of the topics it mentioned, but only because I wasn't expecting those topics to be mentioned. It was 5 out of 5 stars for sure. I got the peaceful nature side, but also a thrilling plot that brought a little closure and redemption to the ending of the last Heller book I read, which was The River. So this book, you could have read it out of order, but with The River, it didn't rely on it. But I would definitely suggest reading The River first before you read The Guide. I would read more of his books, for sure, in the future. Alright, next book I read was The Moon by Night by Madeleine L'Engle. And this was a super, super skinny book, but I rated it 3 out of 5 stars, and I'll read my review. This was a very easy read with a very basic storyline. I read it at work. If I wasn't reading it at work, it would probably only take 2 days to finish. The language was super easy to read, but not so basic or childish that it was cringe. It was the perfect book for reading at work, but not one I would necessarily suggest as a must-read for any other occasion. It's easy to read, it's an interesting storyline, but it's really basic, it's not too complex. It doesn't take that much of your brain power to read it. Next book, The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. I rated it 4 out of 5 stars, and my review was super short. I said, it was a good book, just not everything it's hyped up to be, in my opinion. So people talk about this book like it's a holy grail, but I don't really think that it's that good as it's hyped up to be. It's an interesting story. I would recommend. That's why I wrote 4 out of 5 stars. However, the one turnoff for me was that it really talks about Catholicism in a really bad light, portrays it as something that's really horrible, but it twists them around and uses it in a false way and but presents it as if it's true. Next book I read was Chasing Francis: A Pilgrim's Tale by Ian Morgan Cron. I rated it 5 out of 5 stars. I said this was a great spiritual book. It was short, easy to read, and kept my attention the entire time. There were no boring parts. I love how the author included a lot of history and facts about St. Francis and presented it in an interesting way that flowed easily with the story. I would recommend this book to any Christian, Catholic, or Protestant because it has a beautiful message. Next book I read was The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. I did not like this book. I've heard a lot of people suggest it, and that's why I read it, and it was kind of popular. Would never read again, wouldn't suggest it. This book was so sad. I cried multiple times in it. The entire book was pitiful and heartbreaking. Just when you thought it was about to get better, it just got worse. I would not recommend. The entire time I was reading this book, I kept thinking about it and getting sad, even when I wasn't reading it. It made me very downtrodden, even days after I finished it. You can probably tell I don't like sad books, I don't like sad endings. But this was the most depressed a book has ever made me in my entire life. Just don't read it. Last book I read this year, Paper Towns by John Green. I rated this 3 out of 5 stars. This was a good, fast read. I picked it up because it seemed short and easy to read. It was in fact easy to read, but not all that entertaining. It was labeled a young adult mystery, but I wouldn't classify it as a mystery at all. It's more of a story about this boy's journey, and wasn't the kind of book that makes you feel a type of way when you're done. I would classify it as shallow, easy reading. Would I suggest it? Probably not. And that's all the books that I read in 2023. It's 14 books total. That's not counting things that I read for school. Let me conclude this video by saying thank you guys for watching, and subscribe if you want to. So yeah, thanks for watching.